You don't need to feel better before you keep going. In Finland, there's a word for continuing anyway, and today I'll walk you through 5 things Finnish people almost never complain about. Things that would trigger a running commentary of frustration in most American lives. By the end, you'll understand why the absence of complaint isn't suppression. It's something closer to freedom. There is a man named Aleksi who runs long-distance races through Finnish winters, the kind where the air itself seems to work against you, where visibility drops to almost nothing, and every runner around him is breathing through frozen scarves. Ask him how a race went, and he rarely mentions the cold, the exhaustion, or the parts that went wrong. He'll mention the trail, the light on the snow, whether he felt strong at kilometer 30. The discomfort is simply assumed, so thoroughly assumed that naming it out loud would feel almost beside the point. Before we go further, I want to say something clearly, because it will change how you hear everything that follows. If you find yourself narrating every discomfort as it happens, the cold room, the slow line, the mildly unfair meeting, that habit isn't a character flaw. It's a culturally trained reflex, one that treats verbalizing discomfort as a way of processing it. Sisu offers a genuinely different relationship to hardship, not suppressing the feeling, but simply not requiring it to be spoken in order to be endured. Sisu is often translated as grit or perseverance, but both words undersell it. It describes a specific capacity to act through difficulty, not after the difficulty has been resolved, not once motivation returns, but during the hardest, least motivated part of an effort. It isn't about pretending hardship doesn't exist. It's about a relationship to hardship where narrating it constantly simply never became a habit worth forming. It helps to understand what Sisu isn't, because it's easy to mistake it for stoic emotional distance or a cultural discomfort with vulnerability. Finnish people cry, celebrate, and express joy or sorrow openly in the contexts where those emotions genuinely belong. Sisu applies specifically to hardship endurance, the narrow category of ongoing discomfort, effort, and inconvenience that Western complaint culture has trained many of us to process almost exclusively through verbal narration. It's less a suppression of feeling and more a simple absence of a habit, the habit of turning every difficult moment into a spoken account of itself. Let's walk through what that looks like specifically and how you might borrow pieces of it. The first thing Finnish people almost never complain about is the weather itself, specifically the genuine, prolonged cold and darkness that define a Finnish winter. Months of limited daylight, temperatures that make ordinary errands into small expeditions, conditions that would generate near-constant commentary in warmer climates unprepared for them. Aleksi trains through this every year, and when asked about it, his answer is almost always some version of the same thing. The weather is simply what the weather is, an external fact no more worth complaining about than the existence of gravity. Psychologically, this reflects something researchers call appraisal, the interpretive layer between an event and your emotional response to it. Two people experiencing identical cold can have entirely different internal experiences, depending on whether they appraise it as an outrage being done to them or as a neutral condition to be met. Finnish culture, shaped by generations of genuinely unavoidable winter, seems to have collectively settled on the second appraisal. Not through willpower exactly, but through simple repeated exposure to a condition complaining about never once changed. The shift here isn't pretending discomfort doesn't register. It's noticing the specific moment your mind reaches for a complaint and asking whether voicing it will change the condition at all. If the honest answer is no, Sisu suggests simply letting the observation pass without giving it a sentence. The second thing is physical discomfort during real effort, the burning legs partway through a workout, the fatigue in the last stretch of a long task. Aleksi describes the hardest kilometers of a race not as suffering to escape, but as simply the part of the race that happens there, expected, almost neutral. American endurance culture often treats this same discomfort as something to battle, narrate, or dramatically overcome. Sisu treats it more like weather, present, real, and not requiring narration to be survived. There's a specific cognitive cost to constantly narrating discomfort during effort, one sports psychology has documented directly. Athletes who focus attention on cataloging pain during exertion report the effort as harder and finish slower than athletes trained to simply notice the sensation and return attention to the task. The narration itself, not the discomfort, appears to be what drains performance most. The shift is a small redirection. During a physically or mentally demanding stretch, noticing the urge to mentally complain and gently returning attention to the task itself instead, the way Aleksi returns his attention to his stride rather than his burning legs. The third thing is waiting, specifically the friction of bureaucracy, slow lines, and delays that would produce visible irritation in many cultures. Finnish tolerance for this particular category of minor frustration is well documented and often surprises visitors who expect at least a little grumbling. The line moves when it moves. The form takes as long as it takes. This connects to what researchers call locus of control, whether you believe your emotional state is caused by external events or by your own interpretation of them. Complaining about an uncontrollable delay implicitly treats your peace as hostage to the delay's resolution. Sisu's quieter stance treats the delay and your internal state as two separate things entirely, one outside your control, the other never actually was. The shift is a simple internal question during any wait. Is my irritation actually shortening this line, or just making the wait feel worse? Almost always, the irritation changes nothing about the wait and everything about how the waiting feels. The fourth thing is workload and overtime, the unglamorous grind of simply doing what needs doing without narrating the burden of it. This doesn't mean Finnish work culture lacks boundaries. It has strong ones, generally stronger protections around actual working hours than much of the world. But within the hours actually worked, there's less of the audible suffering through tasks that characterizes complaint-heavy workplaces elsewhere. The task gets done. Commentary about how hard it was tends to arrive rarely, if at all. There's a subtle but important distinction here worth naming. Sisu doesn't ask anyone to tolerate genuinely unreasonable workloads silently. It simply removes the running narration from the workload that has already been reasonably agreed to, treating the difference between a hard day and a bad day as significant, and reserving actual complaint for the latter. Now here's the fifth, and it's the one that tends to surprise people most, because it's not really about big hardship at all. The fifth thing is minor social inconveniences. Someone arriving late, a slightly awkward interaction, a small favor that goes unacknowledged. These tend to generate significant commentary in complaint-heavy cultures, entire conversations built around processing minor social friction after the fact. Sisu's influence here is subtle but real. Small social frictions are absorbed rather than narrated, treated as part of the ordinary texture of being around other people rather than incidents requiring resolution through discussion. Here's what's worth sitting with about this specific category. It's not that Finnish people don't notice these small frictions or don't feel a flicker of irritation. It's that the flicker isn't treated as needing an audience. Something happens, it registers, and then, without any dramatic act of will, it simply passes. The way Aleksi lets a cold kilometer pass without narrating it, because narrating it was never going to change the kilometer. There's a particular social cost to the alternative that rarely gets named directly. A friend group or family that processes every minor friction verbally tends to keep minor frictions alive far longer than they'd otherwise last on their own, the retelling itself becoming a kind of rehearsal that deepens the groove rather than resolving it. Here is the one idea tying all five of these together, the filter Aleksi uses without ever formally naming it. Before voicing a complaint, he asks himself a quiet question. Will saying this out loud change the situation, or only extend how long I feel bothered by it? If the honest answer is that speaking changes nothing about the actual circumstance, Sisu suggests the thought can simply be noticed and released, without needing a sentence built around it. This isn't emotional suppression, and it's worth being precise about that distinction, because Sisu is easy to mishear as simply not feeling things. Aleksi feels the cold completely. He feels his legs burning at kilometer 30 completely. The difference is that feeling something and narrating it turn out to be two separate acts, and Sisu quietly declines to treat the second as mandatory just because the first occurred. There's a version of this distinction that shows up in modern psychological research too, in the difference between experiencing an emotion and ruminating on it verbally. Rumination, the repeated verbal processing of a difficult feeling, has been linked in numerous studies to prolonging and intensifying distress rather than resolving it, which suggests Sisu's instinct, arrived at culturally rather than clinically, may have been pointing at something real long before researchers had language for it. Before you go, here's a 2-minute test you can try today. The next time you feel the urge to complain about something genuinely unchangeable, the weather, a delay, a minor inconvenience, pause before speaking and ask Aleksi's question silently. Will this sentence change anything except how long I dwell on it? If the answer is no, try simply letting the moment pass unnarrated and notice honestly whether the discomfort itself actually lasted any longer for having gone unspoken. A quieter relationship with hardship was never built by pretending difficulty doesn't exist. It was built the way Sisu intends, continuing directly through the discomfort rather than narrating a path around it, trusting that most of what troubles us shrinks the moment we stop handing it a microphone. It's worth adding a final note on where Sisu's limits actually are, because it's easy to over-apply a principle like this until it starts working against you. Sisu was never meant to silence genuine, resolvable grievances, the kind that actually require voicing in order to change, a real workplace problem, a relationship issue that needs addressing, a situation genuinely unsafe rather than merely uncomfortable. The filter Aleksi uses draws that line clearly. Will speaking change the situation? For a resolvable problem, the honest answer is yes, and Sisu has no argument against raising it. The 5 things covered today share one trait in common: weather, physical effort, waiting, ordinary workload, minor social friction. None of them change in the slightest for having been complained about. That's the entire distinction the practice rests on. If this shifted how you think about your own running commentary, share it with someone who might need the reminder that not every discomfort requires an audience to be survived. What's one thing you're going to let pass unspoken this week? Tell us in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.